Hello gardeners, welcome to Native Plant Channel. I'm Lourdes and I'm here with Andy Brand, Director of Horticulture at Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens. I'm really excited to be here. Coastal Maine is a relatively new botanical garden, and they have large areas with native plants that we're going to be seeing today and talking about how gardeners can use them in their gardens. Andy, thank you so much for being with us today. Can you tell us a little bit about the gardens?
Yeah, sure. It's great to be here, first of all. Thanks for coming and talking about one of my favorite subjects, native plants. So the gardens opened in 2007. So like you said, we're a relatively new garden, but we've grown very, very quickly. And we've expanded immensely the past few years. We just opened a new visitor center a couple years ago. We've expanded our gardens. So now we have approximately 19 gardens that are in cultivation and around 325 acres total for the entire gardens.
Fantastic. So we're going to get to see some of these great plants, and let's start our tour.
All right, so I thought we'd start out just looking at some of the plants that we put around in our pond gardens. The focus here has been mainly on plants with lots of flowers, things designed for pollinators, to attract as many pollinators as possible. Butterflies, bees, flies, wasps, you name it, we want to get them here. It's pretty much a wild area. We don't do a lot of maintenance aside from just cutting it back in the fall once a year. Some things we do leave up for some of the other insects late in the winter. One of the special plants here that I really love is this wild petunia, or Ruellia. You see down here it has these wonderful lavender, and you can see why it's called wild petunia. These beautiful tubular lavender flowers that really prefer full sun. You know, that does spread, so it'll eventually form a really lovely ground cover that gets approximately 12 to 15 inches tall. Just where idea here is it's going to spread beautifully in front of this another wonderful native grass, little blue stem, Schizorhynchium scoparium here you see coming up. Beautiful native grass, love it. Host plant for so many different butterfly species. Their caterpillars feed on this grass, which is very important. You know, I would suggest rather than planting this just as like one here, one there, plant, if you can, if you have the space, plant them in mass. It's just much more effective as far as attracting pollinators and butterflies and such to lay their eggs on it if you have more than just one or two. But you see what's really lovely about the little blue stem is this wonderful glaucous blue color that the foliage has with it. Even this particular selection here has this kind of maroonish color to the tips of each grass blade, which is very lovely. So very aesthetically pleasing, takes hot, dry sun. You know, it's one of those prairie grasses, so it really can withstand a lot of harsh conditions. And you can see the Ruellia, the wild petunia, is also doing quite well in full sun, and we've had very little rain, and they've been doing really, really well in those conditions. So this plant in front of me here is one of the mountain mints. We have many different types of mountain mints here at the gardens. This is one of my favorite. It's Picnimum tenufolium, or the narrow leaf mountain mint. And as you see, it has very needle-like foliage on it. Grows about 30 inches tall. Lots and lots of tiny little flowers at the terminal of each stem. And you wouldn't think that these tiny flowers would be that attractive to many pollinators, but as you can see here, it is a favorite with both our honeybees that we have in our apiary, but also so many of our native bee species, as well as different types of butterflies and other pollinators. They just cover this, and if it was completely quiet here, you would be able to hear the happy buzzing from these different types of bees that are on it right now. It is just crawling with all types of honeybees and bumblebees right now. Full sun is ideal for this plant. Again, it can take really harsh conditions. You know, dry soils, once it gets established, don't seem to phase this plant. It does slowly spread and form a nice colony over time. So if you have a few of them together, you can expect after 3 or 4 years, you know, a colony that's probably 4 or 5 feet wide and then about 3 feet tall or so. A beautiful monarch just went through looking probably for a place to lay eggs. Okay, this is a fun little spot to stop at because there's lots of neat things to look at here. We've got some really cool native plants that people should really consider putting in their gardens. The first one is this tufted hairgrass, Deschampsia sespatosa, that you see here. It's a tall grass, you know, it's about 4 to 4.5 feet tall when it's in flower. Usually it's just this mound of dark green foliage at the base, and then these flowering stalks come up, and then they turn this wonderful tan color and then persist for the remainder into the fall, which is quite lovely. And what I really love about this grass is, even though it's quite tall, it doesn't block what's behind it. It's kind of a see-through grass where you can see the black-eyed Susans, the Joe Pye weed, and other plants that are flowering behind it. So it teases you a little bit. You can see through, and it kind of brings you in, and you want to see what's behind it. And one of the coolest plants I think we have in this section and in the gardens in general, one of my favorites, is this type of bee balm. It's called spotted bee balm, Punctata. And everybody's familiar with probably the bright red Monarda that, you know, everybody plants because hummingbirds just go crazy for it. But this Monarda punctata, the spotted one, is completely different looking from that one. You can see it when you get in close. It has those similar little tubular flowers that you're familiar with the red form. But then it has these wonderful kind of silvery pink bracts that are all around each tier of flowers. It's very almost layered, as you can see here. I'll break one off just to kind of hold it up a little bit, and you can see how beautiful that is, you know. And it's spotted because each of the individual flowers are covered with little kind of like orangey brown spots on each one. And this one is also very attractive to many different types of pollinators, particular bees. Love this particular plant, but ornamentally it's just beautiful. You see that kind of beautiful, kind of silvery pinkish cast that it adds to the landscape, and then combine that with the Deschampsia in front, but then put a big Joe Pye weed behind it. Joe Pye weed's just coming into flower now here in Maine, in first week of August. And usually, you know, everybody with Joe Pye weeds, you think of plants that are going to get 7 to 8 feet tall. You know, Joe Pye weeds love moist soils. That's usually where you find them in the wild here, or in like damp meadows, places where you'll have other plants like Cardinal flower, maybe, other things that really don't want their soils to dry out. But as you can see here, we actually have this planted in soils that are on the dry side. And what's nice about that is the plants are still thriving, but what's happening is I think it's reducing the height of the Joe Pye. So it's a little more usable for smaller landscapes. You know, rather than, a lot of people don't have the room for something that's going to be 8 feet tall and maybe 4 or 5 feet wide. Here we have something that's maybe 4 feet wide and approximately 5 to 5.5 feet tall. Otherwise, it's all the same, these beautiful lavender pink flowers that are just starting to open, and they'll be covered with all different types of insects that you can imagine. Bees, butterflies will love it. And then just moving down the line here, it's not quite in flower, just won't be in flower until later in August, early September, and that is Clethoral Nifolia, or the summer sweet. It's a shrub typically that you'll find in swampy areas, along pond edges, stream sides. It definitely prefers moist soils. The flower clusters will be these terminal clusters of fragrant white flowers. Take some part shade to full sun, but the damp soils are pretty key for it. It does spread and will form a large thicket over time. Wonderful plant for late season color. This is a shrub that could get eventually 8 feet tall, and then, as I said, it does spread by rhizomes and underground stems and will form a nice mass over time. But perfect for like that edge of a woodland where the soils tend to be moist, or if you have a pond edge, you want to put some fragrance and some white flowers and something that's going to attract late season pollinators. Clethoral Nifolia or summer sweet's a good choice.
Yes, and for people, for gardeners who are really looking for fragrance, it's just an outstanding plant. You can smell this before you're anywhere near it. It's just, the fragrance is very sweet and stays around for quite a while.
Yeah, it's beautiful. So if you want to attract hummingbirds to your yard, you have to plant Lobelia Cardinalis, or cardinal flower. This is a wonderful later summer flowering perennial that really prefers damp, moist soils to do well. When you see this in the wild, you'll see it growing along stream sides, pond edges, where it's just flourishing, and it's just like a beacon in the landscape. You can see how brilliant scarlet red those flowers are, and we all know that hummingbirds love red. And I imagine if we stayed here long enough, we would probably be able to get a hummingbird coming into these flowers. But as I said, requirements can take full sun, part shade. I've seen it in some shady stream sides and doing really well, where it just brightens up a shady corner. This is the height, 3 to 4 feet tall probably when it's in flower. Usually it's just a rosette of foliage the rest of the year, and then really low maintenance. The only thing you need to do with it is cut it back in the fall, and then it'll delight you the following season with these bright red flowers, and the hummingbirds will love you for it. Just in front of us here is another interesting, probably one of my favorite native grasses. I'll say that a lot probably, but and that's this Chasmanthium Latifolium, or northern sea oats that you see here. And called northern sea oats because if you look at the inflorescence, the seed heads that are starting to develop, they look like oats. Very, very attractive. This is a very useful plant. It takes full sun, but also in my garden I grow it in shade, and it does very, very well. The one thing to remember with this grass is it does seed in, so you have to be really diligent about keeping an eye on seedlings and pulling them out as soon as you see them. Otherwise, you could end up with more than you really necessarily want in your garden. But it is it's very ornamental, very aesthetic attributes to it. Nice big fat blades on the stems, and then these very ornamental seed heads. And these are wonderful too to cut, bring them inside, use them in arrangements indoors, dried arrangements. You see it has a very upright, vertical growth habit to it. Not too fussy as far as soils. I've had it in some pretty dry soils, doing quite well. So it's a great all-around plant, but just the key thing is to just be aware that it will seed in. Okay, so in front of me here is probably one of my all-time favorite plants to put near wet soils, wetlands, pond edges, and that is Ilex verticillata, or Winterberry holly. It's a deciduous shrub that can grow 6, 8, even taller feet tall. It spreads and will form, a colony of stems over time, but can be controlled and kept more as restrict its growth habit into a multi-stem shrub. Pretty much doesn't look like much. It's just a nice green shrub. A background shrub in a border would probably be a great use for it. It really doesn't start to shine until the fall, and that's when the brilliant fruits start to develop. And the typical color is bright red, a scarlet red, and they are just wonderful. The fruits develop just as the leaves are dropping off, so you get these bare stems just covered with bright red fruits all up and down the stems. They're wonderful in the landscape. They persist unless the birds eat them. It's a fantastic plant for birds. Robins, bluebirds, you name it, will come in. Cedar waxwings will eat these fruits. And if the birds don't get to them, then you can appreciate them in your garden. It's beautiful after we get like a fresh snow, and these fruits still persist in December, even into January. It's just a wonderful contrast, the white snow with the bright red fruits. Or cut some of the stems and bring them indoors. They're wonderful to use in arrangements for the holiday season. Cut them, use them in wreaths. If you make wreaths for the holidays, put them on your door. Wonderful in vases and such. Just a really beautiful shrub, easy to grow. As I said, it really, in the wild, you find it in moist soils, in swampy areas, pond edges. But we grow it in average soils here, and it does really, really well. It's not too fussy as far as, demanding those wet soils. It'll tolerate some dry soil conditions. Probably not the most droughty conditions, but you can see we haven't had rain for many, many weeks, and this isn't in the wettest soils, but it's doing quite well. The fruit are covering it. The thing with Winterberry to remember is you need a male and a female. And it's only the female plants that produce the fruits. So you need to have the right male around the vicinity to pollinate the females early in the season. Otherwise, you'll be very disappointed in your female plants. Will never have fruits if you don't have the appropriate male to pollinate the female early on.
Okay.
So we're back at our Winterberry holly and Ilex verticillata, and I just wanted to point out this hornworm that I found. It's a type of sphinx moth that lays the eggs on here, and then its resulting caterpillar is one of the hornworms. It's related to the tobacco or tomato hornworms that you may find in your vegetable gardens, but it's happily feeding on Winterberry leaves. And you can see it's got the horn here. You see it's just kind of resting. It blends in very well, so it's using camouflage to prevent being eaten by predators, but it can't escape all the time from parasites. And you can have parasitic wasps or parasitic flies that will find these caterpillars and lay their eggs in them. And then those eggs hatch, and the larvae then of those parasites eat the insides of the caterpillar until they're fully grown, and then form a cocoon. And you'll see a series of white cocoons on the outside of these hornworms. And those are the developing new parasites, the adults that are developing in those cocoons. The caterpillar, unfortunately, is doomed. It's not going to survive that kind of treatment by the parasites, but it just shows the importance of having that balance in our yards, and that's going to be so important to include the native plants in our yards to have that balance and that increased biodiversity, because otherwise it would be so out of balance we'd be in some serious trouble. But just remember, you know, our native plants are not only supplying flowers for pollinators, fruit for birds, they're also supplying foliage for these caterpillars of many of our native moths and butterfly species. So this is just, you know, one of the processes that happens in nature to the way that we control insect species. They're controlled by other insects and things like that. So pretty fascinating, but that's pretty neat. You can see that's its horn right here at the end, and it's playing it's not moving at all because it's trying to be incognito.
Yes, and that's the amazing thing about when we're growing native plants and a variety of native plants is that we are creating a balanced ecosystem. That yes, a few leaves are going to be chewed, but not the entire plant, because there will be parasites, there will be other predators that will come in to naturally control the population.
So we're standing next to, some people consider a large shrub or small tree. It's Aesculus parvaflora, the bottlebrush buckeye, just coming into flower here in Maine, first week of August. Has these, pretty much the name says it, bottlebrush shaped inflorescence of flowers that consists of 50 plus of these little tubular white flowers that are very, very attractive, particularly to swallowtail butterflies. I've noticed they really love these, as well as some of our different bumblebee species too. And it's typically grown as a multi-stem shrub. And just remember, this can get up to 12 to 15 feet tall. So it does need some space. It can get also 10 to 12 feet wide, but can be contained if you want to keep it a little more, you know, in the range of 6 to 8 feet if you need it. But you know, it just covers it with these terminal inflorescence all through that just have a very vertical look to them. There's a slight fragrance to them, which is very lovely. You can see how the stamens and things, the sexual parts of the flowers stick out to give it a nice soft feel to the flower. And I just want to point out here too, what I'm standing next to is showing you what Joe Pye weed, the heights that it can attain. I'm basically just 6 feet, not quite tall, and this is at least, what, 3 feet above my head? So it's pushing 9 feet tall. And the stem is bigger than my thumb right here where I'm holding it. And down below it's probably even much larger. But just a very stately specimen of Joe Pye weed that you're looking at here. And just for the habitat, what this prefers culturally is full sun to part shade, like an edge of a woodland would be ideal for this plant. High canopy shade is also acceptable for the Aesculus parvaflora. If it gets too much shade, you won't get as many flowers, and that's true for many, many things. Flowers and things, if you want a lot of flowers, don't put them in too much shade. But you know, soil-wise, it's pretty non-fussy, which is nice. You know, it's just a beautiful late summer flowering shrub to include in your garden if you have that space for a shrub that can get up to 15 feet tall.
And for those of you with deer problems, one of the great things about it is one of our very few native shrubs that is deer resistant.
So if you have a spot that is really hot and dry and you can't find a plant that's really going to do well, I would suggest you try the bush honeysuckle or Deerville lanicera. This plant can take a beating. You can see here it is surrounded by pavement and hard driveway here that's just crushed gravel that's been compacted. So surrounded by this, it's a little island oasis of Deerville, and as you can see, thriving in these conditions. Full sun, so it just bakes here, but very, very healthy. It's a wonderful rounded habit. As you can see, it grows about 4.5 feet tall and probably at least 4 or 5 feet wide. It does slowly spread by suckering, so it will form a nice mass planting, such as you see here over time. The flowers, unfortunately, it just finished flowering, but the flowers are quite lovely. They're little yellow flowers in each terminal here that resemble honeysuckles. So if you remember what a honeysuckle flower looks like, it's that tubular yellow flower, or it can be red with some of the honeysuckles. But these look like those flowers, just much more reduced, and they're a bright yellow color, not super showy by any means, but very attractive to, particularly I've noticed bumblebees love them. They adore the flowers on this. Flowers for many, many weeks, so it's a good source of food for many pollinators for a long period of time. And then it just fills that niche where you need it, where the soils are just really, really bad and really hot and dry. Deerville lanicera. One thing too is here we have Deerville growing in full sun, which it's thriving, but when you see Deerville in its native habitats, frequently you'll find it in shade. Not the darkest shade, but a fair amount of shade and doing quite well. Granted, it's not going to be quite as dense and lush as you see here, but it's going to provide you with a ground cover and provide you with some flowers and just be really wonderful shrub for most of the season for you in that shaded situation. And another plant for those really hard, harsh conditions is Camptonia peregrina, or sweet fern. And actually it's so hot here right now, you can almost smell the spicy fragrance that the foliage has in it. It almost volatilizes with the heat, and you can get that spicy fragrance. It's not a fern. The reason it's called sweet fern is because the foliage resembles the foliage you'd see on a fern frond. That kind of dissected, lacy foliage. And called sweet fern, if you crush it in your fingers and you smell it, it has a really spicy, wonderful fragrance to it. It's one of my favorites. I swear every time I walk by a patch of this, I have to pluck a leaf off, crush it, and smell it, because it's just such a wonderful fragrance. But this can take really, really bad soils. If you have a hot, dry, sunny slope where you can't grow much else, this is the plant for that. It will do fine, and one of the reasons it does so well is it fixes its own nitrogen. So it doesn't require a lot of input as far as fertilizers and all, so it can grow in really gravelly, dry soils because it can fix its nitrogen, and it can tolerate soils that see very little in the way of moisture during the season. But full sun is ideal, but again, kind of like with our bush honeysuckle, it will tolerate some shaded situations. A lot of times if you're in a hike in the woods and you come to an opening, you may find sweet fern in those situations as well. So we're going to cool off a little bit. We had to get into some shade because we've been talking a lot about sun-loving plants and moisture-loving plants. And so just looking at a few great natives for shady situations, this is maidenhair fern, Adiantum pedatum. Probably my favorite native fern. I just love the look of the fronds. It's so different from your typical fronds that you see on what people think of ferns. It's almost, you can see it here. I broke one off just so people could appreciate it a little bit more. It's very spreads out quite a bit with these fingers almost, if you will, in this wonderful pattern. Very delicate looking, but strong and a super grower. It does like moist soils that aren't going to get very dry. I found this in the wild growing in like where streams come out into the woods, along the stream edges, and those kind of damp, moist woodland settings. It's beautiful there. It will take a range of soils. A lot of times you'll see this in soils that are more basic as far as the pH, but we have acidic soils here and they're doing quite well. It doesn't want to dry out. In ferns in general, if the soils get real droughty, they're going to show it very quickly, and their fronds will turn kind of brown and not look so great. So you want to be careful that it doesn't dry out, and then you maintain the moisture around the root systems of the ferns. But it will slowly spread and form a wonderful deciduous ground cover. This is the height, approximately 24 inches tall or so, sometimes 18 to 24. And like I said, it'll just slowly spread and form a really beautiful, lacy, delicate ground cover. A couple companion plants for that. One of my favorites is the native bloodroot, Sanguinaria canadensis. That's a spring ephemeral, and that means, you know, bloodroots flower in April, very, very early. Beautiful white flowers that come up to maybe 8 inches tall, the perfect white with yellow centers. But they're starting to go by. You can see the foliage, it's starting to turn yellow. So the spring ephemerals typically will go dormant when temperatures get really warm, soils get dry and it gets hot. That's when your spring ephemerals will go dormant and disappear. So if you grow such plants, you just need to be careful that you know where they are, because once they go dormant, you're not going to see them. So you don't want to accidentally plant something in its place or on top of it. So that's something to keep in mind. And I just wanted to point out too, this is the root structure of bloodroot. It does spread and form a nice colony. It seeds in, and it seeds in throughout the garden, and that's thanks to ants, of all things. The ants love this fleshy structure that's on the bloodroot seeds. So the ants grab the seeds, take them back to their nest, eat that fleshy part, and then discard the seeds. So that's why if you grow bloodroot and you wonder why a bloodroot shows up, you know, 25 feet away from where your patch is, you can thank the ants for that. They're moving them around for you. But bloodroot refers to the color of the root system. If you break it, you can see it oozes this bright orange-red sap. Thus the name bloodroot, and the genus name Sanguinaria, sanguine being for blood. So very appropriately named, Sanguinaria canadensis, or bloodroot. Easy to transplant if you want to, easy to grow from seed, or if you have lots of ants, you're going to have them throughout your shade garden. It's a wonderful shade plant for early flowers, and then a great companion for the maidenhair fern.
And guys, during my visit, I just wanted to point out this really fun exhibit currently taking place called Guardians of the Seeds, which consists of a number of gigantic trolls. And the point is to try and teach why every part of the tree is important to the whole forest.
All right, so we're over in our children's garden, and we have can't quite see it here, but behind this hedge of plants is a pond. So we're on the edge of a pond's edge, and these are kind of a lot of the plants you might see in the wild growing along a pond edge. One of my favorites is the Clethoral Nifolia, or summer sweet, just coming into some early flowers. We could smell this as we were walking over. Just these few flowers open. It has such a wonderful, powerful, sweet fragrance. It's just will perfume this entire area eventually once they're all in flower. But loves this edge of a pond setting. Multi-stem shrub will form a big thicket of stems over time. Will eventually get, could get up to 8 feet tall. Bright yellow fall color on this too, which is nice. So it also gives you multi-season interests. And just a wonderful late season flowering native shrub. Attracts many, many different types of pollinators. Insects, like your butterflies, your bees and such. Wonderful plant. Growing with that is a taller shrub. This is a spice bush, Lindera benzoin. Loves wet soils. In the wild, this is an understory plant you see in like lowland areas where the soil is always tends to be moist, like along a river floodplain. You'll see this growing under red maples, Acer rubrum. Big shrub. You can see how tall this is getting. It can be easily could get up to 15 feet tall. Very big multi-stem. What we do occasionally when it starts getting too big is we'll go in and we'll take out the biggest stems and then let some of the smaller ones take over. Thing to remember, as we mentioned with Winterberry, there are male and females with the spice bush. The females produce these brilliant red fruits. So if you want the red fruits, you need to plant both a male and a female. So just to ensure that when you're planting these, the nursery has to have them sexed for you so you know you're buying a male and a female, or you have to play the odds and get multiples and hope you get at least one male in there with the females. You can see on here, the fruits are still very young. They're green. They're just starting to develop here. If I take a few leaves off to show them, you can see them right here. They look like little olives almost. They're going to get maybe a half-inch long over time, and they're going to turn bright, bright red. Brilliant. Again, yellow fall color, as with the Clethora. This will also have wonderful fall color. Probably my favorite aspect of the spice bush is that it's the host plant for the spice bush swallowtail butterfly. It's one of the main food sources for that butterfly. And I guarantee almost 99% if you have a spice bush in your yard and you're in the range where spice bush swallowtails fly, you will more than likely have those butterflies, the females, laying eggs on this plant. It's a beautiful little perfect sphere egg that's laid on the underside of the foliage. And then you just need to check your spice bush if you have them in your area and look for leaves that are folded over. And if you do find that, carefully open up, and more than likely you're going to find the larvae or the caterpillar of the spice bush swallowtail in there, because they feed on mainly spice bush, but also another native, a great tree, sassafras, is one of its other main food sources. So this is something to keep in mind. You know, we want to plant shrubs because we like them. They look nice, they smell good, they have beautiful foliage, but we're also planting our natives because we want to increase the biodiversity in our yards. And you're going to do that by planting as many native species as you can. And that will add to a lot more biodiversity. Right. So there's a big, strong interest these days in growing our own native fruits in our yards. And one particular plant that's really caught on recently is pawpaw, Asimina triloba. It's a native plant more to the Midwest part of the United States and down into a little bit into the Southeast, but it's fantastic. This is it here. You can see it's not a towering plant. A lot of times when you see it in the wild, it's an understory tree. You'll see it in lowland areas, along rivers. You'll see it spreading. It does sucker, so that's one thing to be aware of. You'll see we kind of maintain it, but you can see here these suckers all through here come up from the root system. So we get in there, we're pretty diligent about pulling those off all the time. Otherwise, this would be entirely pawpaw stems, many, many stems. So it's not an appropriate tree for people that have a small yard. You need a lot of space for this, or you need to have a gardener out there maintaining it for you. But it's got interesting kind of maroon, felty like flowers that you'll kind of get hidden by the foliage, but they're very unique looking, that in the spring when you take the time to look, they're very fascinating. They're pollinated by things like bees and flies, things like that. But now the fruit are starting to develop, and they're like a kidney-shaped fruit that can get up to 6 to 8, maybe even 9 inches long, and it looks like a big kidney bean. And I'll just try to show you here what one looks like developing. You know, this one's approximately 2 inches long. You can see comparison to my hand here. And they're very hard. These won't be fully ripe until sometime in October is when they'll be ripe. And they'll start to take on kind of a yellowish cast to the skin, and then they'll either drop to the ground or we'll come in and pick them, let them ripen a little bit more. And they have a wonderful custard-like consistency, very sweet, tropical, fruity taste to them. People really love them. They have these big brown, black seeds inside that you need to pick around. But just a fantastic native, unusual tree to have if you have the space for it. That's our native pawpaw, or Asimina triloba. And if you're into trying new, quirky fruit trees, native trees, I would definitely give this one a try. So if you want to attract butterflies and pollinators to your garden, you definitely want to include Echinacea purpurea, or purple coneflower, or coneflower. As you see here, it's just a magnet for butterflies. You can see right now we've got this little skipper butterfly on the cone right here, along with the bumblebees. But they attract so many different types of pollinators. You know, this is the species Purpurea. You see it's growing to a height of about, 4 feet tall. Loves full sun. It flowers now, and it keeps sending up flowers for the next few weeks. Then the birds love the seeds, which is great. So you're feeding the insects, and then the birds will come in, like goldfinches, things like that, will come in and feed the seeds, or sparrows on the ground. Once the seed heads disintegrate and drop to the ground, you'll get the sparrows. But it loves full sun. This is great, mixing it in with our friend Joe Pieweed again. Not real fussy with soils. Average soils are fine. I've got it growing in different parts of my garden and throughout the gardens here, and all different types of soil types, and they're doing quite well, except for the very wettest and probably the very driest. But you can see, these are the petals. All of these are all little flowers right inside here, and that's full of nectar and food for our butterflies and other pollinators. Behind the coneflower, we have this big, massive shrub. There are actually several of them in here. It's not all one plant. These are multiple plants here. This is Cephalanthus occidentalis, or buttonbush. And buttonbush is one, you'll often see it in the wild growing in standing water. It can tolerate having water, being inundated by water. Like if you have a river that floods periodically and the stems and root systems are covered with water, buttonbush loves that. It doesn't mind that at all. So it does like wet soil, so you'll often see it growing along ponds, along streams, rivers. And here you see where we have it in the gardens, it's in a drainage ditch. So the water from our roadways and such and pathways come into this drainage ditch. It gets inundated with water. The buttonbush is thriving. This is the inflorescence. So it's made up of all these little flowers. And then these are undeveloped flowers, so it's going to flower once, and then you can get multiple other ones. There's a cultivar that was introduced a while back called Sputnik. And the idea was because they thought this resembled one of the satellite up in space, which if you look at it, if you have a good imagination, you can imagine that. But adored by pollinators again. I keep saying that, but so many of our native plants are really loved by our pollinators, and that's why we need to have them in our yards, is to attract all the pollinators. Once these flowers go by, they develop into these tiny little nutlets that, again, think birds like sparrows and goldfinches and other types of finches will come in and just devour the seeds because they're so tasty and so nutritious for the birds. Very lustrous dark green foliage that you see here on buttonbush. So wonderful foliage plant throughout the spring and summer, and now in the height of the summer in August, it's just coming into flower and will flower for most of the month of August. It'll be in flower with these wonderful white balls of flowers. Wonderful plant for wet soils. So I wanted to be sure we didn't miss one of my favorite mountain mints. We have many mountain mints growing in the gardens, but probably my favorite is this Picnimum muticum, or clustered mountain mint. It's not only wonderful for pollinators, our bees, our honeybees that we have here in the apiary, but our native bee species. But it's also very aesthetically pleasing. You can see how the top of this plant has this wonderful silver sheen to it. Just a beautiful covering, and this is a plant that is eventually going to start to spread and form a big thicket, and you can see we have it planted throughout here. So imagine next year, these were recently planted this year, imagine next year where this is going to be full of plants that'll get taller. They're a little bit short right now, but they'll get up to maybe 30 inches tall, and they'll be covered with different types of pollinators. And another great thing with this is just take a piece of the foliage and crush it and smell it. Super spicy, very minty. It's almost overwhelming if you take in too deep a breath, but it's just a wonderful plant. The flowers are very tiny, and as the common name says, they're clustered. right in the very center here. Very tiny little lavender purple flowers that the bees come into, and they find really nutritious nectar in those flowers. Full sun is ideal for this plant, keeps it nice and dense, nice and silver in color, and it spreads nicely. But the flowering parts have this wonderful silvery cast to it.
Hey guys, I'm here with Vanessa, who is the Interpretation and Exhibits Program Manager, who's going to talk to us about these really awesome caterpillars and their food plants. Vanessa, can you tell us more about them?
Yeah, so I'm standing here at the Discovery Cart that we have outside because this is a special week. Every year we host Caterpillar Lab that is inside in our education center today, and we'll be here for an entire week. We love when they come. They bring hundreds of different types of caterpillars, and all of us who love caterpillars and the natural world learn so much from them. I have a couple of examples here on my table, and I thought that I'd just share with you this one story about my favorite, the hickory horned devil. This is a caterpillar that turns into a beautiful moth, and as you can see, it's a very, very large caterpillar, and you can see where he gets his name. He has these gorgeous horns that end with black tips. Very, very beautiful. He has an interesting story and a little bit of a sad story. Back in the 1890s, when the gypsy moth first showed up here in America, is a great example of fooling with Mother Nature. You know, they thought, oh, we've got to stop this gypsy moth, and they imported a tachnid fly that parasitizes the gypsy moth. What they didn't realize, and nobody had bothered to study, was that the tachnid fly has 2 life cycles in a season, and this gorgeous caterpillar, the hickory horned devil, he has 1 life cycle, but the gypsy moth only has 1 life cycle as well. So the tachnid fly did help with the gypsy moth population, but in its 2nd life cycle, it ended up taking away and extirpating many of our local caterpillars like the hickory horned devil. I think you will only find extirpated means extinct locally. I think you, though this was found in Maine, you can only find it now as far north as New York State. So that's just one example of the amazing caterpillars that are inside today that you will see, and that have an amazing story and have a lot to teach us about the future of taking care of our native plants and our native insects that are so crucial as the bottom of the food chain for everything else, including us.
Andy will be back to tell us more, but I wanted to make a note of the health strips that I noticed when I arrived here at the gardens. Health strips are that strip of soil between the road and the sidewalk, and think about the tough conditions that plants here have to endure. This is the summer of drought here in the Northeast, and yet these plants still look good. So instead of a lawn or grass that uses up our precious water or looks brown and dead if it's not watered, isn't a planting like this far more interesting? Not only is it far more attractive, but it's also far more productive, feeding bees, butterflies, and creating habitat for a number of insects. The grass you've been seeing is little blue stem, which Andy spoke about at the beginning of our tour. The plant with the white flowers is mountain mint. Another plant that was discussed earlier, tough as nails and great for pollinators. The yellow is some type of Rudbeckia, I'm not quite sure which one. And here we have the lavender blooms of Monarda fistulosa, whose common name is wild bergamot. This is another lovely plant that attracts tons of pollinators. Again, some mountain mint. Look at all the bees on it flying around. This is an example of what can be done in a hot, dry, tough place.
Well, I wanted to be sure that we definitely included one of the milkweed species. This is Asclepias incarnata, the swamp milkweed. As the name implies, it typically is found in wet areas along swamps. Soils that are quite moist is what it prefers. But as you can see here, where we have it growing, it's not swampy, it's not wet at all, and it is very adaptable. At least for us, it's been really great We can grow it throughout the gardens. These are growing outside our butterfly and moth house, and the soils, we do irrigate some, but they are somewhat on the dry side and it is still flourishing. The typical flower colors you see here is this lovely pink coloration, terminal clusters, adored the flowers by many types of pollinators, wasps, and different types of bees and butterflies. The height, you can see it's about 3 to 3.5 feet tall, much narrower foliage than we get with some of our other, like the common milkweed that you see growing in fields and it takes over. This is a clump forming plant, so it's much more restrained. You will get seedlings coming up, which, to be honest, is not all a bad thing. If you're gonna have one plant reseed in your yard, why not it be a type of milkweed? Obviously milkweeds are highly important to the monarch butterfly. That's what monarch caterpillars feed on, is exclusively types of milkweeds. So the more milkweeds we can include in our yards, the better the monarchs will be doing. They were just recently put on endangered species list. So their populations are being closely monitored because they have been in decline the past few years. So, we encourage everybody to grow milkweeds. These are the swamp milkweed, but there's butterfly weed, which has the bright orange flowers. That's a little bit shorter, likes full sun. Swamp milkweed typically likes full sun as well, but it will also tolerate some shade. It's a wonderful plant, and we're supporting pollinators with the flowers, but then more importantly, or equally as important, we're supporting our monarchs with the foliage that the caterpillars need to survive. And I'll point out here on this, I just noticed in this flower cluster here we have a monarch caterpillar, a young one that's feeding on the flower buds. You might be able to see it right here. Yep, now you can get even a better look at it there. So wonderful plant all around. Easy to grow. Probably one of the easier species of milkweeds to grow. Doesn't take over your yard. It's restrained, clump forming. Just a fantastic plant.
So everybody, thank you for watching. We've learned so much today. Andy, thank you so much for what you've done with us for today, for educating us on all these great native plants. And again, you've been introduced to some plants that will help you in difficult situations, very dry, poor soils. Andy has helped us out with that. Thank you so much for doing it.
Oh, my pleasure. It's been a lot of fun. I hope you can come back.
Yes, that would be great too. I loved it. And come visit Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens for more ideas on what you can grow in your garden.